Welcome to the Long COVID podcast with me, Jackie Baxter. I am really excited to bring you today's episode. Please do check out the links in the show notes where you can find the podcast website, social media and support group, as well as a link to buy me a coffee if you are able. You should not rely on any medical information contained in this podcast and related materials in making medical, health-related or other decisions. Please do consult a doctor or other health professional. I love to hear from you. If you've got any suggestions or feedback or just want to say hey, then please do get in touch. I really hope you enjoy this episode, so here we go. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Long COVID podcast. I'm really excited to introduce my guests today. I have Dr. Margaret Koziel, Chief Medical Officer, and Bill Hinshaw, CEO of Axcella Therapeutics, and we're going to talk a bit about possible treatment for long COVID and a clinical trial that it's involved with. So welcome both of you to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having us, Jackie. Yeah.
So to start with, would you both mind just briefly introducing yourselves and what it is that you do?
Sure, I'll start. So, Jackie, first, thank you for having us on with you and for your audience, and also for sharing your voice and platform for what is a very important issue and one that we're compelled by and grateful to be able to share our passion and our, I'll say, we're compelled to try to help, okay? And so that gets into what I do. So I'm the CEO of Axcella Therapeutics, and I'm responsible for helping lead the organization in terms of advancing important programs to help patients across complex diseases. And Margaret is one of our key leaders who helps us do that. So Margaret?
So I would also like to thank you for allowing us to participate in this conversation. It's really important for people who are trying to develop therapies and people who have a disease to have this kind of conversation. So thanks for letting us into that conversation. So for myself, I'll go back to my roots as an infectious disease provider. I started off many years ago. I was doing research in an academic medical center, also doing clinical trials. And I'll say that I've appreciated this kind of conversation from the beginning of my career. I was involved in clinical trials in people with AIDS. Or HIV, and they were an essential part of the conversations about how to develop therapies beginning forward. So since that time, I actually transitioned into industry when I wanted to take some of my academic findings and really translate them into therapies. That's what drives me, is every single day I think about, if somebody is sick, how can I make them better? And what can I do with the skill sets I have to move things along? So that's why I'm here, and we're very excited to be working on long COVID and the program, given the enormous public health needs that we see.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Would you explain just a little bit about what Axcella Therapeutics does?
Certainly. So Axcella Therapeutics is a clinical stage biotech company. And so what does that mean? What we're looking to do is we're looking to help restore patients' lives who have complex diseases. The way we're looking to do that is to harness the power of what are called endogenous or natural metabolic modulators, EMMs. These are compositions of amino acids and putting them together directly to address the multiple issues that people with complex diseases face. I'm sure many of your audience are familiar with Moderna, of course, as a company that's pioneered a new approach to vaccines. We were founded by the same company, Flagship Pioneering, that founded Moderna. And what's at the heart of all of those, Jackie, is a big transformational question. What if you could? And in our case, it's what if you could use these compositions of endogenous molecules to restore health in people with complex diseases. And so we have put together a series of programs, two of them in important liver diseases, where we have tested programs 1125 and 1665 in those settings and have global phase 2 programs going with those programs. And that's what led us to the need in long COVID. So we put together compositions of amino acids to try to address the needs of people who have complex diseases, and hopefully do that in a way that is multi-targeted, meaning we're hitting the different drivers of the disease at the same time, do it in a way that's oral and safe and well tolerated, because you're working with the body systems to restore people's health.
Fantastic. I was going to say what got you into long COVID, but I suppose it's really got to be quite a big thing now, hasn't it? Much bigger than a lot of us thought maybe to start with.
No, that was part of it, Jackie. So what compelled us to come into long COVID was both the science and the need. And as you're pointing out, the incredible growing need. So what we looked at, like many people in the life sciences industry, is could our approach, in our case, working with the endogenous metabolic modulators, help people who are suffering from acute or as it developed long COVID. And our program in NASH, or fatty liver disease, 1125, had demonstrated important impacts preclinically and clinically in pathways that then were showing up as important drivers of long COVID fatigue and muscle weakness. And so we looked at those combinations of data and evolving need and went to the world experts and said, do you believe we have an opportunity to make a difference here in this important area? And as you're pointing out, then we started to see the numbers just growing and growing. And not only the numbers, but of course, the actual impact on the people, right? And how this was not something that was passing, this was sustained, this was devastating. And then we said, okay, we have an opportunity to try to investigate this and see if we can make a difference for these patients who clearly have a need. And that's where we reached out and initiated our phase 2A trial that we have ongoing with the University of Oxford right now.
Yeah, so that's basically led me on to the next thing I was going to ask, actually. So you mentioned Oxford University. You're working alongside them on the research and the trial. How does that work?
Yes. So in thinking about long COVID, as we were starting to think about how we could possibly address the problem, we talked to a number of experts across a range of specialties, first learning what the problems are, what are the medical problems, and second, all the ways we could study it. So we ended up working with Oxford and really designing the trial together through a shared understanding of the biology and their expertise in how to measure some of the biologic impact. So specifically what we're looking at here is we're using a very specialized kind of X-ray. It's called magnetic resonance spectroscopy. And they're the world leaders in how to use this particular test to measure muscle metabolism. In addition, they're also world leaders in the clinical care of individuals with long COVID. So it really was a joining of the minds. They've been fantastic partners in helping us design the study and are conducting the study because of that very specialized expertise. So it's been a great partnership.
Amazing. Are you able to talk a bit more about the scan that you just mentioned? Because I think a lot of the frustration around people with long COVID is that, your tests are fine, so you must be okay. And, people with long COVID coming back and saying, well, I know that test says I'm fine, but I'm quite clearly not. So that something is actually picking up that we're not fine is, I was going to say it's quite nice. I'm not sure that's quite the right word, but, it's sort of validating.
Yeah, I understand that is part of the frustration is there is no clear-cut single diagnostic test. And I think we should talk about long COVID as a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms. Some people have a different pattern than others. They all have long COVID, right? They're all emanating. So we're looking at a subset of individuals. And first and foremost, they have to have had severe fatigue. So we're using a test. It's what's called a patient-reported outcome. So we ask questions and we measure, and you say you have to meet a certain level of fatigue on this scoring system to enter the trial. So that's one thing. So that is something that people can tell us. I'm really tired. What we're using here is a very specialized research test. This isn't something that you would see in a normal clinical practice. And it was developed to look at a part of our body called the mitochondria. The mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells. They also direct a lot of other body processes, like how you respond to an infection. So they really lie at the center of a lot of things that make us function and have normal function, including energy, including some of the autoimmune things that you've heard about in long COVID. So this is a test, and we know that in individuals with long COVID, and specifically in individuals coming into this trial, that there is evidence of profound disruption of the mitochondria when they come into the trial. So again, this is something that I want to bridge what we can do in a research setting, which is what we're doing here, to what people are experiencing clinically. And there are a lot of people, including us, working on, are there ways we can crystallize that information and develop it to something that's more useful for the practitioner out in the field? And lots of people are working on, are there serum markers, blood markers, and so on, that would help identify some of these buckets within long COVID. So I understand the frustration, but I want to be clear that in a research setting, we can do these things. They're both true. People are suffering, and they have this mitochondria by specialized testing.
Yeah. And I suppose if the mitochondria are, the powerhouses like you described, then that can explain the sort of wide-ranging symptoms as well, possibly, if they're at the heart of everything.
Yeah, if the mitochondria are not working well or they're disrupted. And so part of the story here is that the virus very early on, like many viruses, goes in and essentially hijacks the mitochondria, because the mitochondria are one of the ways that we fight back against viruses. So the virus goes in, like little sneaky things that they are, and they turn off the ability of the body to respond appropriately. And so that's what you're seeing in many of the post-viral syndromes, including long COVID, that these mitochondria, along with other things, are disrupted. They're not functioning normally. And in essence, the body is almost turned against itself.
Yeah. So we're so busy fighting ourselves that it's tiring us out almost.
Right. So you've probably seen some of the papers, for example, where people, are measuring things like antibodies. Those are proteins that are produced in response to an infection. And all of a sudden, all of these antibodies, including against our own proteins, start going up in long COVID. So there's clearly a sign that the immune system has been misdirected, if you will. It's going in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that can clearly be linked to a lot of the symptoms that individuals are feeling.
Sure. Do we know why this happens to some people and not to others?
The short answer is no. That's the essential mystery at some of this. People have been looking. We know, for example, women appear to be develop it more frequently than men. Now, is that on the biologic basis, or is that a societal basis that sometimes women seek out care for illnesses? That's a great debate that goes on in many fields in medicine. So our people are trying to track that down, but we don't have a simple answer yet. We know it's extraordinarily common. We know that it's a feature of this particular virus, much more so than other viruses, which do actually cause a similar symptom, but nothing to the degree that we're seeing with COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. So this new drug, well, since it's not a new drug as such, is it? The very catchy AXA1125, is that what you call it?
That is what we call it at this stage of development. Yes, Jackie, we're in a stage that's called clinical development, where we're testing the impact of the drug candidate on patients and hopefully having the benefit that we're looking for. Once you go to full approval, that's when you name a drug and provide a different sort of acronym than we have right now. Yes.
Bill will get a catchier name applied to it at some point.
Oh, amazing. Am I right in thinking that this is the same drug that you were talking about, you were using with the liver trials you were talking about?
Yes.
So you've sort of got a bit of a basis that it works to help some people then already.
Yeah, Jackie, this is a very insightful comment and question, because this is part of what connected us to long COVID is what we call preclinical and clinical signals that we saw with 1125 in the non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or liver disease area. It was having impact on important pathways like fatty acid oxidation, like cellular respiration, so how the cell breathes, and ATP generation. That's the energy currency of the cell, along with inflammation, and as Margaret mentioned, and the immune impacts. So we saw that preclinically and clinically. And then that's what we went and discussed with experts like Oxford, and then used that to open up the trial that's underway, and we expect to report data out on in the middle of this year.
Yeah, because actually, interestingly, I think there was some evidence that came out, might have been last week, of quite recently, of a massive increase in hepatitis cases in children, I think, in post-COVID. So could that be connected as well, maybe?
Well, I think across the range of individuals with COVID, we do see immune systems gone awry, right? And so we know that that can happen in the liver, like in other places. And so that will cause the liver enzymes to go up, which clinically people could call hepatitis. So I think it's part of the same overall sort of dysregulated immune response that we're seeing. I don't think that anyone has shown that the virus itself damages the liver in the chronic setting, but you might see some of these elevated liver enzymes just as part of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Jackie, one small point I wanted to build off of the last point was, and it was part of your question, we know a lot about AXA1125 already because of the stage of development that it is in for the liver. So we have a lot of information regarding our safety, our dosing, our ability to produce the product. And that's what allowed us to move very rapidly with Oxford and open up this trial and hopefully help us both first get that data, discuss that with the regulators and the experts, and then move forward to the next stage of development as quickly as we can.
Yeah, of course. So you were able to sort of get moving a lot quicker than if you were starting from nothing.
Correct.
Yeah, well, that's great. I don't think you'll find anybody arguing with that.
Speed in these cases is always an important priority, as is quality and rigor. And that's where I wanted to stress the amount of information and knowledge we have and go back to the fact that our products work with the body system. So they're amino acids and they're derivatives. So your body is used to processing these. The art and the science of this is we're putting together specifically to address issues that the body's facing. But that allows us to date have a very well tolerated and safe program. And that's what we hope to continue to have.
Yeah, of course, because I think, again, one of the frustrations among people who, well, I was going to say people with long COVID, but anybody who's ill, is that, you know, they want things to happen fast and they want to be better now. But of course, any sort of research, it takes time because it needs to be done right, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
So yeah, of course, it will take the time it takes.
Well, I think the good news here is that, number one, to our previous comments, we're in a position to move rapidly and test this. Number two, the regulatory agencies do continue to try to facilitate important advances for patients who have needs like in long COVID. We do need to understand that this is part of the pandemic. And I know you and your colleagues out there know that all too well. Right. What we have to make sure is that the broader governments and the rest of the medical community also take that same position and continue to put the energy behind this. We have found the MHRA, which is the regulatory body in the UK, to be very thoughtful and supportive while maintaining the high quality measures that they need to in this case. So we'll continue to progress as rapidly as we can. With the right level of quality to make sure that whatever we bring forward to the patients has been tested appropriately and is in a position to deliver what they need.
And if I could just add something, it goes back to what I said. I think this is where patients actually have a particularly important role to play in difficult and diseases and places where people are struggling. The voice of the patient really gets heard at the government level. They are listening, and I've been through actually a couple of circumstances now over the course of my career where the patient voice had a huge impact in what was ultimately done. And that can be anywhere from how the regulatory agencies view it to whether there's government funding for research into a problem to designing the clinical trials. And those are all important things. So I would urge your listeners to really get involved wherever your government is. Be active, be a voice, be loud. I know this is hard when you're tired and you're not feeling well, but it's really, really important. And it really helps people like us who are trying to develop therapies to have people, if you will, advocates for us for drug development at every stage of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think speaking for myself, I think, people with long COVID, they want something that they can do to help. So yeah, writing to your government or your representatives or whoever, or whatever it is that you do, it does help, even though it doesn't often feel like it, I guess. So I know we've talked a little bit already, but are we able to talk a bit more about the science behind the drug? I mean, what does it do? Or what are you hoping that it will do?
So let me take that one, Bill. So we are hoping that it impacts, again, and by design, we're not going after any one thing. We approach our therapies in a very different way than many other companies that'll say we're targeting one single target. We're trying to do many things. We think at the heart of it, the mitochondria are involved in what's going on for reasons that I think, again, it directs so many processes. We also can affect directly through some of the compositions, we can affect some of the inflammatory responses directly. It doesn't necessarily have to involve the mitochondria. We could be improving blood flow to the limbs. So there are several different ways that we could be working, which is particularly important when you're dealing with complex syndromes, right? In any one individual, there could be a balance of factors going on, but by targeting all of them at once, we hope to have a greater benefit for more people.
Yeah. We'll be right back. I'm interrupting myself for a second to tell you about long COVID breathing. The fabulous Vicky Jones and I have teamed up to bring you long COVID breathing. We are both passionate about sharing our expertise and experience of the breath and how incredibly helpful that can be with long COVID. We've worked together to develop a course that is specifically tailored to those with long COVID. It's a 6-week course with 12 sessions, all delivered online. The community feel and learning that we're all sharing is such a joy. To find out more information and to sign up for our courses, workshops and other shorter sessions, please check out the link below, longcovidbreathing.com, or email longcovidbreathing@gmail.com to start your breathing journey with us. Fantastic. So, fingers crossed.
Yes.
So, you mentioned that this is was it a stage 2 trial, I think you said? I guess partly what does that mean, and how does a clinical trial such as this actually work?
So drug development classically is done in 3 stages. The first is when you test it in healthy volunteers. The second is when you start to go into patients. And the third is when you really prove that your drug does what you say it will do, that's the determination of efficacy. So that's the classic drug development path. Now, we're fortunate, as Bill said, that we already have some data from our trials in non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, that's the liver disease. So we already knew we were starting from a little farther along that journey, and it is a journey, in order to do this trial. So we feel pretty confident about its safety in individuals with non-alcoholic steatohepatitis. Many of them are the same people who also got COVID, as it turns out, just coincidentally. High rates of diabetes and so on. So we already knew about safety. We already knew something about dosing. So we're able to start this trial. And again, to be clear, this is really an initial look with Oxford, again, using this very specialized technique. To really prove that it helps people with long COVID, we're going to need to do larger and longer studies. That's just the part of it, to know how long we have to give people before it really makes them feel better. So those are things that we're going to have to learn in the future. But our first step is to say, does this work in some way that we can have confidence that it's really going to help people with long COVID and take that next step in the journey? So that's where we are right now. And so that's classically called a phase 2 study. But we're looking every day to see how we can accelerate that, to see how can we go as quickly as possible, because we all want to, at the end of the day, we'd all like to have something in the hands of practicing physicians that they can use to make people feel better, right? That's where we have to go. So we're looking at all the ways that we can accelerate those traditional steps. We're all naturally impatient at heart, by the way, I should say that. And we're highly motivated to keep things moving along. But that's where we are. We're at the beginning. We're not at the very, very beginning of a journey that you might see with more classical drug development. We're somewhere in the middle, but we still have some work to do before we can figure out whether this really helps people.
So is the trial, that's happening in Oxford or in and around Oxford? Is it happening elsewhere in the world, or is it just Oxford?
No, we're working with the center in Oxford because of it's this specialized radiographic technique that they have expertise in.
Yeah. So how do you measure whether it works?
So we have this magnetic resonance-based technique, this radiographic technique. That's one whether. We're also doing blood tests, because there are blood tests that you can do to measure the health of the mitochondria and the muscles. So there's something called lactate. If any of your listeners are athletes or you've read about people running marathons, like it happened in Boston this weekend, lactate builds up in the muscles when they're under stress and exercise. So we can measure blood lactate and see if that improves. Now, we can measure markers of inflammation. And we're also asking people whether or not they feel better. So there's a patient-reported outcome that measures fatigue. It's been used before in chronic fatigue syndrome, and we're looking to see whether that improves. At the end of the day, that's what we're really interested in, if people feel better, right? So we have all of these going on in the trial to help us understand where we are.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you say you're sort of early into the process of this stage. Do you have any results yet, or is it a bit new?
So we're not done with the trial yet. We expect to be reading out about mid-year, roughly. So we're still underway in the trial. Again, it's at Oxford. They're doing very well. Unfortunately, there's no shortages of patients in the Oxford area to draw from. I wish that it were so, but it's not. But they are recruiting. We expect to be announcing those results in the mid-year.
Brilliant. Oh, well, maybe you can come back and talk to me about the results when you get them.
We'd love to. We'd love to.
So my next question was, what happens next? When you get the results, then you need to analyze and go through them, I guess. Is that what happens at that point?
Yeah, Jackie, what we would do is we'd analyze the results, we'd discuss them with the key investigators, and then we would discuss with the regulators, both in the UK, but also at that stage, we would be looking to expand the next phase of clinical development. And that may include the United States or other parts of Europe or the rest of the world, depending on the step we would do. So we would analyze, have the right discussions with the regulatory bodies and experts, and then decide the next step going forward and how we would be testing that. That's where we would try to be as fast, as effective as possible to answer the core questions and demonstrate that AXA1125 has the desired impact and makes a difference in these people's lives. That would be the next step.
Of course, yeah, and we all appreciate that analysing and crunching data, it does take time, doesn't it, to do it right?
Absolutely. And this, again, is a complex setting, as we've talked about, and we want to make sure that we have the benefit that our products are endogenous or natural, and they work with the body system, and they're generally safe and well tolerated. At the same time, anytime you're asking people to participate in a trial, you want to have the right, what's called risk-benefit profile. And that's something we take very seriously. And again, we have a wonderful opportunity to make a difference here, and we want to make sure we do that right.
Yeah, of course. Is there a way for people with long COVID to be involved in the trial at the moment? Is it still recruiting, and is it very local to Oxford? It's
still recruiting. Because this is a clinical trial, people need to be able to come to the site. So we've encouraged people who are local to the Oxford area. I think there may be people who live some distance away who are willing to participate. We realize that, especially with the burden of fatigue, that it could be very difficult to do all the traveling. And so it's really, I think most practically, it's for people who live in and around Oxford.
Yeah, of course. It's a bit of a trek from Scotland.
Yeah.
So that's obviously in the short term. In the longer term, we hope that it works and it gets rolled out. So if this stage of the trial is successful, then the next stage is the sort of the third of your stages of the trial. Is that right?
Correct, yes. We would then expand it into what's called a phase 3 program. Sometimes, Jackie, there's an interim step that you would take that sets up for the phase 3. That's part of what we would discuss with the agencies. And to your point, that's when it would be more broadly accessible in terms of geographically. Now, we will look at that and determine what's the best way to do that, and with what are called sites, the investigator sites, meaning the research locations. And that would be the next step in the process. And again, we look to do that as quickly as we can, because we understand how important this is for patients and their families. Right? This is a really devastating situation that yourself and others are in, and we'd like to help as quickly as we can. But as you pointed out, it has to be done right.
So so that sounds like you branch out, and do you set up other sites around? I was going to say the UK to start with, but in other countries as well, I guess, as it gets branched out.
Yeah, so we would look to expand, and obviously this is a worldwide problem. So what we look to do in the next stage is to diversify, to reach different groups, to try to balance across the range of people. What we look and say is who's got long COVID, and then try to balance that. In our choice of sites and locations, sometimes, for example, we have to set criteria. So, for example, if long COVID turns out to be majority female, that's what we try to emulate in the studies. We want to mirror the population who has the disease to the extent possible. So that's what happens typically in phase 3, is that you really branch out and you broaden your populations to reflect. Often in the initial phases, it's a very small subset, and then you expand.
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that long COVID is a very varied illness. It presents in very different symptoms in different people. Day to day, week to week, month to month, but very varied. And do you think that if this does become a treatment, that it would be suitable for all people with long COVID, or just those presenting certain symptoms?
Yeah, so here we're really focusing on people with fatigue, which isn't, I hate to say, it's not really focusing, because that's actually the majority of people with long COVID, right?
It's huge.
So we're really going after that. And it again, because of our understanding of how this amino acid composition works, that's why we're going after that. It's not only that it's common, it's because we think it's going to work against that. Now, we know that there are other symptoms that are very important and troubling to the people who have them. I have less confidence that we're necessarily going to be able to address all of those symptoms, but we are going after something that we think is pretty common and very important to the people who do have it.
Jackie, we'll be measuring. I fully support what Margaret said first, that, there's unfortunately a large constellation of what patients experience, and we need to stick with the science where we can make the difference. We will be evaluating as part of this how patients feel and certain what are called biomarkers or measures that allow us to understand where we could have an impact around the fatigue area, focus, if you will, and that's what we will then guide the program towards in the next steps.
Of course, because just finding a way to measure fatigue is quite difficult as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's that sort of invisible illness thing again, isn't it? You look fine. That's not really the point. But like you said, even if it doesn't manage to address everything, every single different symptom that people have, fatigue is probably in most people with long COVID quite a big thing. So if it would solve that, or certainly help that, then that would go a huge way to certainly giving people some sort of quality of life back. So that would be huge.
And we know in the UK, even before the Omicron variant came on board, that it was estimated that 2% of the population had long COVID, right? And so those are enormous numbers for a society. But then when you break it down, and then more than half of those patients are experiencing fatigue, and then the day-to-day experiences that people like yourself know far better than we do, but we're trying to address, then the impact could be very important.
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. Because the fact that it's a lot of people that should be working as well.
Well, that's the societal aspect, and that's part of what Margaret was speaking to about the patient voice. Patient voice is so important, both because, of course, there's so many priorities that are going on that the governments and the providers need to hear how important this is. They need to understand y'all's experience. And then as a society, this is a big group of people who should be working, contributing, having as productive a life as they are able to. And if the disease is not allowing them to, and yet there are options to try to help it, then that's something that everybody can get around and can make a big difference for the patients. So that's why Margaret was so passionate about describing that and the role that other patient populations have been able to have in changing, I'll call it the narrative, either from a government or a medical perspective. And we know how important that can be here.
Absolutely, yeah.
I will say I did have the opportunity. I listened to your podcast, the first episode where you and your partner describe what you went through. And I think that's quite a story. That's all I'll say. So again, thanks for putting it out there. It takes a certain amount of bravery to go out there and tell a story like that, and then to continue to do this, to continue pushing through. So thank you for inviting us on.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, thank you both so much for joining me today and for bringing your expertise and talking about what you're up to. It's been really interesting hearing how all of this is coming together, and I'm sure I'm not alone in wishing you all the best for the next stage and hoping it works out. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. And grateful for everything that people are willing to do to help us get there. And thank you, and best wishes to you and your listeners. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of my guests and to you for listening. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least found it useful. The Long COVID podcast is entirely self-produced and self-funded. I'm doing all of this myself. If you're able to, please go to buymeacoffee.com/longcovidpod to help me cover the costs of hosting the podcast. Please look out for the next episode of the Long COVID podcast. It's available on all the usual podcast hosting things. And do get in touch